Here is the first 6,000 plus words extracted directly from your file, unedited. A police officer callously forced a disabled black woman with no legs to get out of her car despite her explaining her condition. This cold-hearted act sparked outrage, but what happened next left everyone in shock. Discover this emotional moment and don't forget to hit follow so you won't miss more groundbreaking stories. The soft morning light filtered through the curtains, casting gentle rays across the walls of the small apartment Claire Bennett called home. The steady beeping of her alarm clock pulled her out of an unclear dream. With hands accustomed to the task, she reached for her phone to silence the alarm. For a moment she lay still, absorbed in the quiet that enveloped her surroundings. Claire's room was compact, yet cozy, adorned with simple items she cherished. On the bedside table, a small photo frame held a picture of her family from her childhood. In the photo, Claire's bright smile stood out as she stood between her parents, looking at the picture. Memories of her hopeful childhood and big dreams flooded back. Claire turned toward the bedside table where her prosthetic legs rested. She attached them, recalling the painful journey of learning to stand again. Driving through familiar streets, Claire felt the tranquility of the morning sun shining through her windshield. Her thoughts lingered on memories of her time in the hospital and the words of Nurse Susan, a reminder that each day was an opportunity to live better. She smiled and pressed the accelerator gently, eager to meet friends, but the peace didn't last long. A police siren wailed behind her, yanking Claire back to reality. Through the rearview mirror she saw flashing blue and red lights and a patrol car following closely. Her heart skipped a beat, but she quickly calmed herself. She checked her speedometer. She wasn't speeding. Claire slowed down and pulled over, wondering what she had done wrong. The patrol car's door opened and a tall man in uniform stepped out. Adjusting his hat, his tense demeanor was unmistakable. It was Travis Harper, a well-known strict officer in the area. Claire rolled down her window as Harper approached, feeling the weight of his disapproving gaze. "Good morning, ma'am," Harper said, his voice low and somewhat cold. "Do you know why I stopped you?" Claire frowned slightly but kept her voice steady. "Honestly, I don't, officer. I haven't broken any traffic laws." Harper crossed his arms, glancing at her vehicle. "You're parked too close to the past pedestrian walkway. This area is for pedestrians and you're obstructing traffic." Claire turned to look. Her car was indeed near the edge of the walkway, but hadn't crossed the marked boundary. Her vehicle was specially designed and she always took care to park within the rules. "I don't believe I've parked incorrectly, officer," she said, her voice calm. "This is a disabled vehicle and I have a valid permit." Didn't seem satisfied with her explanation. He tapped the car frame lightly, his gaze scrutinizing Claire as though looking for another reason to proceed. "All right. Then I'll need you to step out of the vehicle and show me your papers." Claire paused momentarily, taken aback by his request. "I can't step out of the vehicle, officer. I'm disabled and use prosthetics. If you need my papers, I can hand them to you through the window." But Harper's expression hardened, his eyes growing colder. "I'm asking you to step out of the car," he repeated, his tone firmer. "I need to conduct a thorough check." Claire sensed the unease in his words and the frustration underlying his stance. Harper wasn't new to the force, but he had recently faced many challenges in his career. Pressures from his superiors left him feeling undervalued. Handling cases like this seemed to be his way of asserting authority, as if it could soothe his Grievances officer, I'm not trying to be uncooperative, Claire said, her voice soft but resolute. I can't leave the vehicle. Due to my condition, if needed, I'm willing to cooperate and provide my documents right here. Are you not listening to me? Harper interrupted, impatience flaring in his eyes. This isn't a request, it's an order. Claire felt a chill run down her spine. She had faced many challenges since her accident, but never before had she felt so demeaned. I'm not trying to make things difficult for you, she said, maintaining her composure. I'm simply asking for understanding. Harper stepped closer, his voice dropping but filled with pressure. Understanding? Do you think you're special? Everyone follows the law, including you. I don't have time for people who refuse to cooperate. At that moment, CLA realized this encounter wasn't just about a traffic stop. There was something deeper fueling Harper's actions, and anger he carried from elsewhere unleashed on her because she was an easy target. Claire stared directly into Travis Harper's cold eyes, fully aware that no matter what she said, her words would not reach him. The tension in the air grew heavier, as though it might shatter at any moment. The tension in the air grew heavier as though it might shatter at any moment. I've explained to you, officer, I cannot leave the car because I'm disabled. I'm ready to provide my documents right here, Claire repeated, maintaining as calm a tone as she could. But her words did nothing to placate Harper. He took a step back, his hand gripping the belt at his waist, his eyes scanning Claire as if assessing her level of danger. Deep down, Harper knew Claire posed no threat, yet he felt challenged. Claire's polite refusal seemed to stir a long-standing dissatisfaction within him. Another day, Harper thought to himself, his eyes flickering with a trace of anger. Another person who thinks they can defy me. Another person who doesn't respect me. I can't let this drag on. Harper took a deep breath, trying to suppress the negative thoughts flaring in his mind. He couldn't let this incident escalate, couldn't let it become a scene that drew public attention, and certainly couldn't risk anyone questioning his ability to handle the situation. In recent weeks, Harper had received multiple warnings from his superiors to tidy up his street interactions. Protect the department's image, they said. We don't need more bad press. But now, Claire, a disabled woman sitting in a specially designed car, had become the target of his misplaced frustration. Harper knew this, yet the sense of helplessness brought on by his job pressures had stripped him of patience. Get out of the car right now, Harper shouted, his voice ringing out as a final command. A few passers-by began to stop, curious about the commotion. Some had already pulled out their phones, the blinking lights of their cameras catching Harper's attention. The growing scrutiny only aggravated him further. He felt as though he was being watched and judged by everyone around him. Claire shook her head, resolute. I've told you I can't get out of the car. If you want to check my documents, I'll hand them over right here. But I cannot comply with your request due to my health condition. Her words seemed to be the final straw. Harper stepped forward, reaching through the car window to grab Claire's arm. The rough grip startled her. If you won't comply, I'll have to help you out of the car, Harper said, his voice devoid of any hint of empathy. In Harper's mind, a hazy string of memories suddenly surfaced. He recalled his early days on the force when his heart was full of ideals. He wanted to protect the community, to prove that justice could be served without cruelty. But he had changed. It began with small compromises, turning a blind eye to minor infractions, pretending not to see signs of injustice. Gradually, he was drawn deeper into the system's vortex. Harper clenched his fist, a dull ache running up his arm. If I stop now, he thought, everything I've sacrificed will be meaningless. But if I continue, I'm no longer myself. Once, Harper had been a young officer filled with passion, driven by the desire to do what was right. But everything changed on one fateful night 3 years ago, when a criminal pursuit ended with the death of his closest colleague, a man he considered a brother. Harper couldn't erase the memory of his partner's eyes in those final moments, filled with pain and despair. From that day, Harper carried bitterness and guilt, which slowly transformed him into someone unrecognizable. That event shattered Harper's faith in justice and humanity. He grew rigid, skeptical of everyone around him. Whenever he felt his authority was being questioned, the painful memory would resurface like a ghost, pushing him to assert control forcefully, as if doing so could ease his inner turmoil. Before Claire could react, Harper had opened her car door, gripping her arm tightly and pulling hard. Claire cried out, her voice a mix of fear and helplessness. "Stop! You can't do this! I told you I can't get out!" Harper ignored her. In his mind, the words of his superiors echoed, "Don't let anyone undermine your authority." He pulled Claire from her seat, oblivious to the fact that one of her prosthetic legs had come loose and fallen to the ground. The sound of metal hitting the pavement rang out, followed by a brief silence. The gathered crowd, now swelling, held up phones to capture the unfolding scene. "What are you doing?" "She's disabled," a man shouted from the back. A young woman stepped closer, her eyes blazing with indignation. "You can't treat her like this." Harper felt the pressure of the crowd's gaze and the cameras recording his every move. Instead of relenting, he tightened his grip further, as if to prove he was in control of the situation. Claire felt humiliation and anger surge through her. "You have no right to do this," she said, her voice trembling yet firm. But Harper wasn't listening. This was no longer about law or order, it was about power. The power that he was determined to maintain no matter the cost. Claire's screams echoed through the air, overpowering the blaring horns of cars on nearby streets. Travis Harper, his hand still gripping Claire's arm tightly, seemed oblivious to everything except the relentless demands from his mind. But the growing crowd surrounding them couldn't stay silent any longer. An elderly man with silvery white hair and a wooden cane stepped forward, his eyes blazing with anger. "She's disabled. What you're doing is wrong," he shouted, his voice ringing out like a wake-up call. His words were a spark, igniting others in the crowd to speak up. "You can't treat her like this," a middle-aged woman exclaimed, her hands trembling as she held her phone up to record. "This is violence. Don't you see that?" Rachel Porter, a young woman with a backpack slung over her shoulder, stood nearby, filming the entire scene with her phone. Her eyes filled with determination. As Claire struggled, her phone slipped from the seat to the floor. Without hesitation, Rachel stepped closer and reached toward Claire. "Give me your phone," Rachel called out firmly. "I'll keep recording." Still wrestling against Harper's grip, Claire extended her arm to hand her phone to Rachel. "Thank you," she said, her voice shaking with fear and pain. Rachel took the phone, raising it high to capture every detail, ensuring nothing was missed. Harper's gaze shifted toward the crowd, now too large to ignore. The raised phone's flashing red recording lights made him feel as if he were trapped in a glass cage, exposed to the watchful eyes of the entire world. His breathing quickened, and the anger inside him only grew stronger. "These people don't understand anything except interference," Harper thought bitterly. "They don't know the pressure I'm under." "Step back!" Harper shouted, his eyes scanning the crowd. "This is a police matter. It's not your business." But his words did nothing to quell the rising outrage. Another man, wearing a round jacket, pointed a finger at Harper. "You're using violence against a disabled person. Do you call this doing your duty?" Rachel yelled from the back, her voice fierce but unwavering. "Everything is being recorded. If you don't stop, everyone will know the truth about what you've done." Harper clenched his jaw, his gaze turning even colder. The crowd, with their shouts and judging eyes, felt like a blade cutting into his pride. Yet, deep inside, another emotion began to surface, a feeling of being cornered. Every eye was fixed on him, demanding an explanation, an action different from what he was doing. But Harper didn't know how to stop. Claire, now half dragged out of the car, screamed again, tears streaming down her face. "You're humiliating me. You have no right." The crowd started to press closer, their collective unity forming a wall of protection for Claire against the injustice she was facing. Voices rose from all directions, creating a wave of pressure bearing down on Harper. Some shouted, "Let her go. Leave her alone." The police have no right to do this. Rachel, still holding Claire's phone, stared directly at Harper. You won't get away with this, she said with unwavering conviction. Justice will come. At that moment, Harper felt as if everything around him was collapsing. His eyes darted from one face in the crowd to another before returning to Claire, who met his gaze with a look filled with both anger and despair. It wasn't the gaze of someone defying him, it was the gaze of someone who had endured far too much. The noise from the crowd grew louder, creating undeniable pressure. Travis Harper, still gripping Claire tightly, realized he was standing on a fragile line between authority and public judgment. The stares from the crowd, the shouts of protest, and the flashing lights of phones made him feel completely exposed. Instead of stopping, however, he doubled down, determined to assert his authority. If I back down now, any respect for me will vanish entirely, he thought to himself. Just then, the sound of another police siren echoed, and a patrol car pulled up at the curb. A young officer, Ethan Mitchell, stepped out, his face clearly showing concern as he took in the growing crowd. His eyes quickly landed on Harper, who was forcefully pulling Claire from her car. Harper, what's going on here? Ethan called out, his voice calm but firm. Harper turned, his grip on Claire unrelenting. She's refusing to comply with my orders. I'm just doing my job. She's obstructing traffic and refusing to cooperate, his voice sharp, deliberately ignoring the fact that Claire was physically unable to comply with his demands. Ethan stepped closer, his cautious blue eyes examining Claire, who was still being held by Harper. Her prosthetic leg lay on the ground, and her tear-streaked face was full of fear and exhaustion. Harper, it's obvious she's disabled. The situation doesn't need to be handled this way, Ethan said, his voice gentle but laced with disappointment. Harper let out a harsh laugh, releasing Claire and turning to face Ethan Mitchell. You're too green. This is how we deal with people who don't comply. If you're not firm, they'll walk all over us. Ethan took a step back, keeping his tone steady. I don't believe dragging a disabled woman out of her car in front of a crowd is the way to demonstrate authority, Harper. This should be handled with more humanity. Ethan's words made Harper's face flush red, but not from shame, it was from anger. This kid doesn't get it, Harper thought. In his mind, Ethan was just an inexperienced officer, naive and overly idealistic. But Ethan wasn't completely new. He and Harper had worked together on several cases before, and Ethan had often disagreed with Harper's harsh methods. Still, Ethan's opinions were always dismissed, as Harper believed he knew better. Mitchell, I'll say this one last time, Harper said, his voice low and threatening. Don't interfere with how I do my job. You're not the one in charge here. Ethan didn't back down. He stepped closer to Claire, extending a hand to help her back into her seat. Ma'am, are you okay? Ethan asked, his voice calm and filled with genuine concern. Claire nodded weakly, her breathing still unsteady. I just want to go home. I haven't done anything wrong, she said, her voice breaking. Ethan turned to Harper, his gaze now sharper. Harper, she hasn't violated any traffic laws, and she cannot leave the car. This has gone too far. I'm asking you to stop. The crowd began murmuring, with many expressing support for Ethan. A voice called out from the back, finally, someone is standing up for her. Harper clenched his fists, his eyes blazing with anger. How dare someone like Mitchell challenge me in front of this crowd, he thought. At the same time, he could feel the situation spiraling out of his control. Every passing second made him feel more cornered. Ethan's presence wasn't just disrupting his approach, it was directly threatening the authority Harper had been so desperate to uphold. Ethan gave Harper one last look, his voice resolute. I will report this incident if you don't stop right now. We're police officers. We must protect, not destroy, the public's trust. Harper gritted his teeth, glaring at Ethan for what felt like an eternity. Finally, he stepped back, saying nothing, but in his eyes, the flames of anger and humiliation still burned fiercely. Ethan turned back to Claire. Stay in your seat. I'll make sure you don't face any more trouble. The air felt thick with tension, every eye in the crowd fixed on the police officer's every move. Ethan Mitchell had just helped Claire settle back into her seat, the gratitude in her weary eyes reassuring him that he'd made the right decision. But he knew this wasn't over. "Mitchell, I told you not to interfere," Travis Harper growled, his voice low and angry so the crowd couldn't hear. Harper stepped closer to Ethan, his gaze piercing as if trying to intimidate his younger colleague. "Who do you think you are, standing here teaching me how to do my job in front of everyone?" Ethan took a deep breath, steadying himself. He knew Harper's frustration wasn't solely about this incident but rather a result of the immense pressure he carried. Still, it didn't justify his actions. "Harper, you're in the wrong," Ethan replied firmly but respectfully. "She hasn't broken any laws and clearly explained her health condition. She's not the problem here." Harper let out a mocking laugh, disbelief etched on his face. "You think it's that simple, don't you?" he said, his voice low and dripping with sarcasm. "Mitchell, this isn't just about her. This is about maintaining control. If you let someone like her defy your orders, you'll lose the respect of everyone else. We'll lose the authority this job demands to survive." Ethan glanced back at Claire. She was sitting in her car, adjusting her prosthetic leg and wiping away tears. The sight made his chest tighten. How could Harper see her as a threat? "She's not the person you need to prove your authority to," Ethan said, turning back to face Harper. "And if you think manhandling her in front of all these people is how to earn trust, you're mistaken." Harper stepped closer, his posture threatening. "You better watch what you say, Mitchell," Harper whispered, his tone dangerous. "You have no idea what I'm dealing with. Our superiors don't want to see any weakness. Do you think you can go up against this system?" Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. Harper was right about one thing: the system they worked in was deeply flawed, and challenging it could lead to serious consequences. His career could be at risk if he continued to confront Harper publicly. But Ethan also knew he couldn't turn his back on what was right. "I'm not trying to fight the system," Ethan said quietly but resolutely. "I'm just trying to make sure we don't hurt the people we're supposed to protect. If that gets me in trouble, so be it." Harper's eyes burned with fury as he glared at Ethan. "You think you're a hero, don't you? Let me tell you something, Mitchell. If you keep interfering, I'll make sure you pay. You won't last long in this department." At that moment, another car pulled up to the scene. A middle-aged man with a commanding presence stepped out. It was Lieutenant David Parker, Harper's direct superior. His salt-and-pepper hair and sharp eyes gave him an air of authority as he took in the crowd and the tension between Harper and Ethan. A frown of disapproval crossed his face. "Harper, what's going on here?" Parker asked, his calm voice carrying a weight that silenced both Harper and Ethan for a moment. Harper turned to Parker, his angry expression shifting into one of reluctant composure. "Sir, I was handling a violation. She refused to comply and was obstructing my duties." Parker's eyes shifted to Claire, who sat exhausted and distraught in her car. He stepped closer, quickly assessing her condition, then turned back to Harper. "She's disabled, Harper. The situation didn't need to escalate like this. You're making a mess of it." Harper's face contorted with frustration. "Lieutenant Parker, she didn't follow my orders. If we don't uphold our principles, we'll lose control." But Parker didn't let him finish. "What principles are we upholding if we forget humanity, Harper? I'll review your report later, but for now, step back and let me handle this." His voice was firm and commanding, leaving Harper no choice but to reluctantly step away from the scene. Parker turned to Ethan, his expression softening slightly. "Mitchell, thank you for stepping in when you did. I'll need your detailed report later, but you did the right thing." Ethan nodded, a sense of relief washing over him. Finally, Parker crouched slightly to address Claire. "Miss Bennett, I'm sorry for what happened here today. I assure you this incident will be thoroughly investigated. If there's anything you need, please don't hesitate to let me know." His sincere tone brought Claire a small measure of comfort amid the chaos. Harper stepped back, his gaze cold as it darted between Ethan and Claire. "You think you've won today, Mitchell," Harper said, his voice dripping with menace. "But this isn't over. You'll pay for siding with the wrong people. Travis Harper entered his office, slamming the door shut behind him. His fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white, his mind racing with images from that morning, the glare of Ethan Mitchell, the crowd shouts, and the sea of phones capturing his every move. He knew this wasn't over. As expected, just hours after the incident, videos of the event spread rapidly on social media. The footage showing Harper forcibly dragging Claire out of her car, despite her explaining her disability, was shared thousands of times alongside captions full of outrage. "This is a clear abuse of power," one Twitter user wrote. "We can't let this continue to happen." However, not everyone sided with Claire. Some, influenced by Harper's stern demeanor in the video, defended him. The police officer was just doing his job. If she had complied from the start, this wouldn't have happened, one comment read, sparking intense debates. In a small corner of the city, journalist Michael Hayes sat at his computer, watching the video over and over. Hayes, a seasoned investigative reporter, had spent much of his career exposing misconduct within public institutions. As he analyzed Harper's actions, his anger wasn't just directed at one man, it was a familiar feeling, as if he'd seen this before. Hayes began digging through old records. Within a few hours, he uncovered a shocking truth: this wasn't the first time Harper had been accused of abusing his authority. 3 years ago, Harper had been accused of using unnecessary force against a young black man during a traffic stop. However, the case had been quickly buried, and no disciplinary action was taken. The records had been meticulously concealed, but Hayes recognized the signs of a cover-up. With this information in hand, Hayes decided to investigate further. He reached out to people connected to the earlier case, including witnesses and the victim. Some hesitated to talk, fearing repercussions, but eventually, Hayes gathered enough evidence to show that Harper's behavior wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a troubling pattern. Meanwhile, Claire sat in her small apartment, feeling the chaos of social media through the constant notifications on her phone. She read messages of support from friends and strangers but also saw comments accusing her of exploiting her disability for attention. Each negative remark cut deeply, but Claire tried not to let them overshadow the positivity. In the dim light of her apartment, Claire wondered if this fight would lead to meaningful change or if everything would remain the same. Claire wasn't afraid of failing for herself, she had already endured the greatest loss of her life and risen again. But she feared letting down the people who were placing their hopes in her. If she couldn't succeed, would they lose even more faith in justice? These questions swirled in her mind, creating an invisible but heavy weight. Then she remembered Nurse Susan's words during her time in the hospital: "You can be an inspiration to others." Those words had helped her through her darkest days. Claire took a deep breath, placed her hand on a family photo on the table, and reminded herself that she wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for those who couldn't speak up. A sudden knock on the door pulled Claire from her thoughts. When she opened it, she was surprised to see Michael Hayes standing there, holding a folder of documents. "Miss Bennett, I'm Michael Hayes, an investigative journalist," he introduced himself. "I'd like to talk to you about Travis Harper and what I've uncovered." Claire let him in, her curiosity and apprehension growing. Hayes didn't waste time. He spread out his documents on the table and began explaining. He detailed Harper's prior abuse of power and how he had manipulated the system to escape accountability. "What happened to you wasn't a random act," Hayes said. "Harper has abused his authority before, and I believe this is part of a larger issue within the system he works for." Claire sat in stunned silence. She had thought this incident was simply Harper's misconduct, but now she realized it was part of something much bigger. "What do you plan to do with this information?" she asked. "I'm going to publish it," Hayes replied, his eyes filled with determination. "But I need your help. You've already become a voice for so many people, Claire. If you're willing, your story can be a crucial part of exposing the truth." Claire sat quietly for a moment, considering his words. The weight of her decision was immense, but she knew she couldn't turn away. "I'll do it," she said finally, her voice steady. "If my story can help bring change, I'm willing to share it." The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. Hayes worked tirelessly, piecing together his investigation and crafting a powerful narrative that connected Claire's story with Harper's history of abuse. Claire, though nervous, gave several interviews, sharing her experience with honesty and vulnerability. The article was published and quickly went viral. Titled Abuse of Power: The Troubling History of Officer Travis Harper, it painted a damning picture of systemic corruption and negligence within the police department. Harper's previous actions, which had been buried for years, were now in the spotlight. The public reaction was explosive. Protests erupted in front of the police department, with people demanding accountability and justice. Claire's name became a rallying cry for those fighting against abuse of power and systemic injustice. Amid the chaos, Claire received a call from Vanessa Taylor, a well-known civil rights attorney. "Miss Bennett, my name is Vanessa Taylor," the voice on the line said. "I've been following your story closely, and I believe we have a strong opportunity to seek justice for you and others. I'd like to represent you if you're willing." Claire hesitated. "I'm not sure I'm strong enough to handle all of this," she admitted, her voice shaking. Vanessa's tone softened. "I want you to know you're not alone. Years ago, I faced discrimination myself. I know how it feels to be powerless. But I chose to fight, and I want to help you do the same. Together, we can make a difference." Claire agreed, and with Vanessa's help, she filed a lawsuit against Travis Harper and the police department. The case drew widespread media attention, becoming a symbol of the fight against systemic injustice. Ethan Mitchell, the young officer who had stood up to Harper, visited Claire to offer his support. "I heard about the lawsuit," Ethan said as he stepped into Claire's apartment. "I want you to know I'm willing to testify for you." "Are you sure?" Claire asked, her skepticism evident. "This could jeopardize your career. Harper has already threatened you." Ethan nodded, his expression resolute. "I know, but if I stay silent, I won't be able to live with myself. What he did wasn't just wrong, it's a symptom of a much larger problem. If I can help, I'm willing to take the risk." Ethan's courage gave Claire a renewed sense of strength. For the first time in days, she felt like she wasn't alone in this fight. The weeks leading up to the trial were intense. Vanessa and her team worked tirelessly to build their case, uncovering more evidence of Harper's misconduct and the department's attempts to cover it up. Ethan provided a detailed account of what he had witnessed, and Hayes contributed his investigative findings. Vanessa often reminded Claire, "The most important thing is to tell your story with honesty and emotion. Don't be afraid. People need to hear your voice." The day of the trial finally arrived. Claire stood in front of the courthouse, her hands trembling as she gripped the strap of her bag. She looked up at the imposing building, feeling the weight of the moment. "You've got this," Vanessa said firmly, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. Reporters, supporters, and curious onlookers packed the benches, eager to witness the proceedings. Travis Harper sat across the room beside his attorney, his expression stoic, though a flicker of anxiety betrayed him. When Claire took the stand, she spoke with a quiet but steady voice. "My name is Claire Bennett," she began. "I am disabled, and what happened that day changed the way I view justice." She recounted her story in vivid detail, from Harper demanding that she exit her car to him forcibly dragging her out in front of a crowd. Her voice echoed through the courtroom, every word cutting through the tension. "I wasn't resisting," she emphasized. "I was simply trying to explain that I couldn't comply with his request because of my health condition." When Harper's attorney cross-examined her, he tried to undermine her credibility. "Miss Bennett," he said, his tone condescending, "do you think refusing a police officer's orders in that situation could reasonably be perceived as defiance?" Claire met his gaze, her eyes sharp. "I don't believe explaining my medical condition constitutes defiance," she replied. "I believe it was the right thing to do." Vanessa immediately objected when the attorney's questions became irrelevant and leading. The judge sustained her objections, further bolstering Claire's position. Michael Hayes was called to the stand next. He presented evidence of Harper's troubling history, including records of prior accusations of excessive force. "This is not an isolated incident," Hayes declared. "It's part of a pattern enabled by a system that fails to hold officers accountable." The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as Hayes played video evidence from a previous case, showing Harper engaging in similar behavior. Harper and his attorney visibly tensed as the evidence mounted against him. Vanessa seized the moment. "Your Honor, this is not merely a lapse in judgment. This is a system that allows individuals like Officer Harper to abuse their authority without consequence." Vanessa then called Travis Harper to the stand, her eyes sharp and unyielding. The courtroom grew silent as Harper took his seat, his face a mixture of defiance and discomfort. "Officer Harper," Vanessa began, her voice steady and cutting, "can you explain why you felt it necessary to use force against a disabled woman who had clearly explained her condition?" Harper shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes scanning the room as though searching for an escape. "I was following protocol," he replied, his voice low but audible. "Protocol?" Vanessa repeated, stepping closer. "Are you saying that forcibly dragging a disabled woman out of her car is standard procedure for your department?" Harper hesitated, gripping the edges of the witness stand. "No, but I had to maintain control of the situation. She refused to comply with my orders." Vanessa's gaze remained locked on him. "And did you consider her explanation that she was physically unable to comply with your orders?" Harper's jaw tightened. "I didn't believe it was genuine at the time." "Didn't believe it was genuine," Vanessa repeated, her tone growing sharper. "Yet, even when her prosthetic leg fell to the ground, you continued to use force. How do you justify that?" Harper's face flushed with anger and frustration. "I was under pressure to act decisively," he snapped. "My job is to enforce the law, not second-guess every explanation I hear." Vanessa leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but piercing. "Is that what you call enforcing the law? Or was it about asserting your authority, no matter the cost?" Harper glared at her, but before he could respond, Vanessa shifted gears. "Officer Harper, earlier in this trial, evidence was presented showing that this is not the first time you've used excessive force. In fact, you've been accused of similar behavior in the past. How do you explain that?" Harper's composure began to crack. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the stand. "Those incidents were investigated, and no wrongdoing was found," he said, his voice defensive. "Or were they buried by your superiors to protect you and the department's reputation?" Vanessa pressed. The courtroom murmured, and Harper's attorney quickly objected. "Your Honor, this is speculative and irrelevant." The judge considered for a moment before overruling the objection. "Answer the question, Officer Harper." Harper's shoulders slumped slightly. "I was following orders," he muttered. Vanessa's eyes narrowed. "Following orders? Are you implying that your actions were directed by your superiors?" Harper hesitated, the weight of the room pressing down on him. Finally, he sighed heavily and nodded. "Yes. Captain Rains told us to handle situations quickly and decisively, no matter what." Vanessa pounced on his admission. "So, you're saying that Captain Edward Rains ordered you to use excessive force and disregard the law if it meant maintaining control?" Harper's silence spoke volumes. Vanessa turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I request that Captain Rains be summoned as a witness. Officer Harper's testimony indicates that this issue goes beyond one individual. It is systemic." The judge nodded. "Granted. Captain Rains will be called to testify." When Captain Edward Rains took the stand, his demeanor was cool and confident, but there was an edge of irritation in his voice. "Captain Rains," Vanessa began, "Officer Harper has testified that you instructed him and others to act decisively, even if it meant disregarding proper procedure. Is that true?" Rains smirked. "I've always instructed my officers to enforce the law firmly and fairly. If Officer Harper misinterpreted those instructions, that's on him, not me." Vanessa's gaze sharpened. "Firmly and fairly? Then how do you explain the documented cases of excessive force under your leadership? Cases that were quietly dismissed or buried?" Rains leaned back in his seat, his smirk fading. "I don't know what you're talking about." Vanessa placed a folder on the table. "These are records from internal investigations into multiple incidents involving Officer Harper and other officers in your department. Each case was dismissed, despite clear evidence of misconduct. Were you involved in those decisions, Captain Rains? Rains stiffened. Those investigations were handled by the appropriate channels. I had no part in their outcomes. Vanessa stepped closer. No part? Or did you ensure that they were swept under the rug to protect your department's image? Rains' attorney quickly objected, but the damage was done. The courtroom was abuzz with murmurs, and Rains' composed facade began to crack. Over the next few days, additional officers were called to testify. Some corroborated Harper's claims that Rains had pressured them to prioritize the department's image over proper procedure. Others admitted to witnessing misconduct but feeling too afraid to speak out. The trial revealed a deeply entrenched culture of corruption and abuse, with Rains at the center of it. When the verdict was finally announced, the courtroom was packed with reporters and supporters. The judge declared that Harper was guilty of misconduct and that the department bore responsibility for enabling his actions. Rains was ordered to face a separate investigation into his leadership. Claire felt a wave of relief wash over her as the verdict was read. Justice had been served, but she knew this was only the beginning. Outside the courthouse, Claire stood with Vanessa, Ethan, and Michael Hayes as reporters swarmed them with questions. Claire took a deep breath and addressed the crowd. "This isn't just about me," she said, her voice steady and strong. "It's about creating a system where no one has to endure what I did. This fight isn't over, but today, we took an important step forward." The crowd erupted into applause, and Claire felt a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just a survivor, she was a catalyst for change. In the weeks following the trial, Claire's life changed in ways she couldn't have imagined. Messages poured in from people across the country, some offering support, others sharing their own stories of injustice. Claire realized her story had touched a nerve, resonating with countless individuals who had suffered in silence. One afternoon, while organizing her thoughts for an interview, Claire received a call from Vanessa. "Claire," Vanessa said, her voice calm but enthusiastic, "I've been contacted by several advocacy organizations. They want to partner with you to push for reforms. This could be a major step forward." Claire felt a surge of determination. "Let's do it," she said without hesitation. Vanessa and Claire began working with civil rights groups, disability advocates, and policymakers to draft proposals aimed at addressing systemic issues within law enforcement. They advocated for increased accountability, better training on interacting with disabled individuals, and a more transparent disciplinary process for officers accused of misconduct. Meanwhile, Claire's support group grew rapidly. What had started as a small gathering of individuals sharing their experiences evolved into a powerful community. People came not only to tell their stories but also to brainstorm solutions and organize actions. Ethan often attended these meetings, offering his insights as a police officer and providing a bridge between the community and law enforcement. "I believe change is possible," Ethan said during one meeting. "But it starts with conversations like these. We need to rebuild trust and ensure accountability at every level." Jenna, the young woman in a wheelchair who had joined Claire's group early on, became one of its most vocal members. "For years, I thought my voice didn't matter," Jenna said during a meeting. "But seeing Claire fight back gave me the courage to speak up. Together, we can make sure no one else feels powerless." Claire felt deeply moved by the stories shared in the group. They were a constant reminder of why she had to keep pushing forward. One day, while reviewing a proposal for new police training guidelines, Claire received an unexpected email from the mayor's office. "Dear Ms. Bennett," it read, "we've been following your work closely and would like to invite you to join a task force on police reform. Your perspective would be invaluable." Claire stared at the screen, her heart pounding. She had never imagined she would be in a position to influence policy at such a level. After taking a deep breath, she replied, "I would be honored to join." The task force meetings were intense, filled with debates and differing perspectives. But Claire held her ground, drawing on her own experiences and the stories she had heard from others. She worked closely with Ethan, who had also been invited to join the task force, and together, they advocated for meaningful change. One of their key proposals was the creation of an independent oversight committee to investigate allegations of police misconduct. The idea faced significant resistance from some members of law enforcement, but Claire and Ethan refused to back down. "This isn't about attacking the police," Claire said during one heated meeting. "It's about restoring trust and ensuring that no one is above the law." Slowly but surely, their efforts began to bear fruit. The task force's recommendations were presented to the city council, and after weeks of deliberation, several were adopted. An independent oversight committee was established, and mandatory training on disability awareness became a requirement for all officers. The changes were far from perfect, but they were a step in the right direction. Claire knew there was still much work to be done, but for the first time, she felt hopeful about the future. On the one-year anniversary of the incident that had changed her life, Claire stood in front of a packed auditorium. The event, organized by her support group, was both a celebration of progress and a call to action. As she stepped onto the stage, Claire looked out at the faces in the crowd: Jenna, Vanessa, Ethan, Michael Hayes, and countless others who had joined her in this fight. She felt a swell of emotion but steadied herself. "Thank you all for being here," Claire began, her voice strong and clear. "A year ago, I was just trying to survive. Today, I stand here because of the incredible support and courage of so many people. But this isn't about me, it's about us. It's about building a world where justice isn't just a word but a reality for everyone." The audience erupted into applause, and Claire felt tears welling up in her eyes. She took a deep breath and continued. "We've made progress, but we can't stop now. There are still too many voices that go unheard, too many injustices that go unaddressed. Together, we can change that. Together, we can build a better future." As the applause thundered through the auditorium, Claire felt a sense of peace and purpose. She had turned her pain into power, her trauma into triumph. And she knew that, with the support of her community, the fight for justice would continue. As the crowd dispersed after the event, Claire sat alone backstage, taking a moment to reflect. The energy of the evening lingered, and though she was exhausted, she felt an undeniable sense of accomplishment. Vanessa approached her, a warm smile on her face. "You were incredible, Claire. I've seen a lot of people speak, but the way you connect with others, it's powerful." Claire smiled softly. "I just told the truth. That's all I've ever wanted to do." Vanessa nodded. "The truth is a powerful weapon. But it takes someone brave enough to wield it." Ethan joined them, his usual calm demeanor tinged with admiration. "Claire, this is just the beginning. The reforms, the support group, tonight's event, it's all proof that change is possible." "Thanks to all of you," Claire said, her voice filled with gratitude. "I couldn't have done any of this alone." Jenna appeared from the side, her wheelchair rolling smoothly across the floor. "Claire, I wanted to thank you again," she said, her voice emotional. "You gave me a voice when I didn't think I had one. Because of you, I feel like I can face the world again." Claire knelt beside Jenna, taking her hand. "You've always had a voice, Jenna. All I did was give you a platform. You're stronger than you think." As they embraced, Michael Hayes entered the room, holding his camera. "Mind if I get a quick photo of the dream team?" he asked with a grin. Claire laughed, pulling Vanessa, Ethan, and Jenna into the shot. Michael captured the moment, the four of them smiling, united by their shared mission. In the days that followed, Claire continued her work tirelessly. Her support group expanded, now including chapters in other cities. She traveled to speak at conferences, meet with policymakers, and listen to the stories of those who had been inspired by her journey. One day, as she was preparing for a meeting, Claire received a letter in the mail. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the words inside stopped her in her tracks. "Dear Claire, I saw your story on the news, and I just wanted to thank you. I've been through something similar, and for the longest time, I thought no one would believe me. Watching you stand up for yourself and others gave me the courage to do the same. I'm filing a complaint against the officer who mistreated me, and it's all because of you. With gratitude, Emma." Claire folded the letter carefully, her heart swelling with emotion. It was moments like this that reminded her why she fought so hard. Meanwhile, the police department underwent significant changes. Under new leadership, training programs were overhauled, and the Independent Oversight Committee began its work, investigating allegations of misconduct and holding officers accountable. Ethan found himself becoming a bridge between the department and the community. Though some of his colleagues viewed him with suspicion, others began to see the value in his approach. "You've really shaken things up, Mitchell," one officer said during a meeting. "But I've got to admit, it's for the better." Ethan smiled, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Months turned into years, and the impact of Claire's work continued to ripple outward. Her name became synonymous with resilience and justice, and her story was taught in schools as an example of how one person could spark meaningful change. One evening, as Claire sat in her living room, Jenna called her. "Claire, are you watching the news?" Jenna asked, excitement in her voice. "No, what's going on?" Claire replied, grabbing the remote. As she turned on the television, she saw a report about a new federal initiative inspired by local reforms like the ones Claire had helped implement. It was focused on creating national standards for police accountability and community engagement. Claire leaned back in her chair, a small smile playing on her lips. "This is just the beginning, Jenna," she said softly. Jenna's voice was full of hope. "Because of you, Claire. You started this." Claire shook her head. "No, Jenna. We all did." As the credits rolled on the news segment, Claire felt a sense of calm she hadn't felt in years. The fight for justice was far from over, but she knew she wasn't alone. She had built a community, inspired change, and found her purpose. And in that moment, she knew she would never stop fighting for what was right. As Claire reflected on her journey, she realized how much had changed in such a short time. The scars of her past, the painful memories of that fateful day, had not vanished, but they no longer defined her. Instead, they had become part of her strength, fueling her passion for justice and equality. Claire's life had evolved from one of survival to one of leadership. She had become a symbol of resilience, a beacon of hope for those who felt voiceless. The police department, too, was slowly changing, though Claire knew it would take time for deep-rooted issues to truly transform. But the momentum they had built together could not be stopped. One morning, Claire stood in front of the mirror, looking at the woman who had emerged from the wreckage of her past. She no longer saw the woman trapped in fear and pain, but someone stronger, driven by a sense of purpose. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. "Hey, Claire," Vanessa said. "I have some exciting news." Claire raised an eyebrow, sensing something big. "What's going on?" "Remember the task force we were part of? The mayor's office is officially launching a pilot program based on our recommendations. It's going national." Claire's heart skipped a beat. "That's incredible. This is really happening, isn't it?" "It is. And they want you to be one of the leading figures. You're being asked to speak at a national press conference next month." Claire sat down, overwhelmed. "I never thought I'd be here. I never thought I'd be in a position to make that kind of difference." "You are," Vanessa said with certainty. "And this is just the beginning. You've already changed so many lives, Claire. And now, the whole country is going to hear your story." Claire hung up the phone and looked out the window. It felt surreal, but it was real. She had gone from being a woman fighting for her dignity to being a leader in the movement for justice. The weight of that responsibility both inspired and humbled her. Days later, as Claire prepared for the press conference, she sat down to reflect on everything that had led her here. The first phone call from Michael Hayes, the support group, the lawsuits, the trials, the constant push forward had been exhausting, but it had been necessary. Every step had brought her closer to the larger goal, systemic change. When the day of the press conference arrived, Claire stood before a room full of journalists, activists, and lawmakers. Behind her, a banner read, "Building a More Just Future for All." As she stepped to the podium, her hands were steady. She had done this many times before, but today felt different. Today, the stakes were higher. "Thank you all for being here," Claire began, her voice carrying across the room. "A few years ago, I was just trying to survive. Today, I stand here not only as a survivor, but as a leader in a fight for justice that is much bigger than any one individual." The room was silent, every eye fixed on her. When I was forced out of my car by Officer Harper, I thought that was the worst thing that could happen to me. But I was wrong. The worst thing was realizing that this wasn't an isolated incident. It wasn't just about me, it was about a system that allowed officers to abuse their power without consequence. It was about a world where disabled individuals like myself were treated as less than human, as invisible. She paused, letting the words settle in. But I stand here today with the knowledge that we can change that. Together, we are building a world where no one is above the law. Where justice is not just a word, but a practice. We've fought hard for this moment, and we won't stop until it's not just a law, but a reality for every person who has ever felt powerless. The applause was deafening, and Claire felt her heart swell. The people in this room, the people outside, the ones who had supported her, they had all become part of this movement. She wasn't alone. Ethan stood at the back of the room, his expression proud. He had become a close friend and ally throughout this journey. Their work together had not only helped reform the department but had also helped bridge the divide between law enforcement and the community. As the press conference continued, Claire answered questions about the new reforms and how the program would be rolled out across the country. Each answer felt like a small victory, a step closer to the world she had envisioned. Afterward, Claire sat down with Michael Hayes, who had been documenting her journey from the very beginning. "You did it, Claire," Michael said, his voice filled with admiration. "You've not only changed the narrative, you've started a movement." Claire smiled, a sense of peace washing over her. "We did it, Michael. All of us. I couldn't have done this without the people who stood by me." In the months that followed, Claire traveled across the country, meeting with community leaders, law enforcement officials, and activists to continue her advocacy. She helped train officers, spoke at rallies, and worked with legislators to ensure that police reform was not just a buzzword but a lasting change. But through it all, Claire never forgot the people who had inspired her to keep fighting, the ones who shared their stories with her, the ones who had suffered in silence for far too long. They were the true heroes. Claire's support group flourished, and she found herself mentoring others who had experienced injustice, guiding them through their own journeys. She was no longer just a figurehead, she was a part of something much bigger. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Claire sat at her desk and looked at the photo of her family. She had come so far from the woman in the picture, full of hope and dreams, but that woman was still there, alive in the work she did every day. She closed her eyes for a moment, taking in the quiet, peaceful feeling that filled the room. She had made a difference, but the fight for justice would never end. And that was okay. Because now, she knew she was never alone in that fight. Her journey was far from over.